Hello, my name is Larcenia, and 2 months after I left the hospital, I came home to find my house gone. Not sold, not foreclosed, just taken. My name was erased from the deed, my things were in the trash, and my mother-in-law handed me a bill for $95,000, smiling like she was doing me a favor. My husband, he said, Mom handled it. I stood in what used to be my art studio, but now had her name on the door. They said I left them, but I was the one replaced. How do you fight a family that rewrites the truth faster than you can recover? Would you walk away or start writing yourself back in? 2 months can change everything. I used to think that was just something people said when they couldn't face what stayed the same. But as the bus rumbled past the familiar stop signs and sleepy driveways of South Eugene, I realized I no longer knew what familiar meant. My body was still healing, weak hands, slower balance, occasional dizziness, but what hurt more was how eager I was to return to something I thought would hold me steady, my home. I hadn't wanted anyone to pick me up from the hospital. I said it was because I needed space, some time alone after weeks of white walls and whispered nurse updates. The truth, I was nervous about walking back into a life that had paused without me. I wanted to see it with my own eyes before anyone told me what it had become. The air smelled like wet fir trees and grass when I stepped off the bus. A soft drizzle had settled in, typical for March here in Oregon. My coat clung to my shoulders as I rounded the corner onto our street. My heartbeat stayed steady until I saw nothing I recognized. I froze. There, where my moss-covered one-story house used to be, stood a new structure, taller, squarer. The siding was a pale, sterile gray. No porch swing, no mailbox I painted by hand. No ivy climbing up the front window. I blinked several times, clutching my small suitcase. Maybe I got the address wrong. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the nearby houses. Same red-roofed bungalow next door, same wooden fence 2 homes down. This was the spot. My spot. But the house, my house, was gone. I walked closer, dragging my suitcase behind me like a reluctant dog. The walkway had been repaved. The small cherry tree I planted in our 2nd year of marriage was nowhere to be found. In its place was a concrete slab with a motion sensor light. I stared up at the unfamiliar door, taking in the new intercom, the keypad lock, the shiny black welcome mat that read, "Live, laugh, love." I wanted to laugh, but my throat tightened instead. I pressed the bell. No sound, just a soft click, and then footsteps. The door opened, and there she was, Mayless, my mother-in-law. "Larcenia," she said, her lips curling into a warm smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Sweetheart." You're finally back." I blinked, mouth half open. Where's the house?" She stepped aside with a practiced sweep of her hand, like a realtor showing a model home. "It's still here. We just made a few upgrades. It was time, really. Too drafty, not energy efficient." I didn't step in. I couldn't. My legs wouldn't move. Her eyes sparkled as she reached for a folder on a narrow table just inside the doorway. "Oh, before I forget." She pulled out a crisp piece of paper and held it out like a birthday card. "We had to remodel, obviously. Turned it into a duplex so we could have more space. Destry and I are on one side. You and your art stuff, when you're ready to move back in, can take the other. For now, though." I reached for the paper. My fingers trembled before I even touched it. The number was circled in blue ink at the bottom, $95,000. She tilted her head, still smiling. "Since your name is still technically on the deed, it made sense for you to handle the renovation costs. Of course, we fronted it, no rush on repayment, but it's only fair." I stared at the paper. It wasn't just about the money. It was the handwriting, clean, confident loops. The polite way she said repayment, like I had borrowed something when I hadn't even been conscious. It was the way she said we when she meant I, and space when she meant control. I didn't ask to come back to a construction site. I came back for my home, for the comfort of creaky floorboards and coffee mugs I picked out, for the chipped paint on the bedroom wall that we never got around to fixing, for the kitchen that Destry used to joke was too small but still made him feel like a real husband. Now, all of it was gone. Destry's inside, unpacking some things, Maylis said, stepping forward as if expecting me to follow her in. We weren't sure when you'd be back, but the remodel was a long time coming. I looked up from the invoice and met her eyes. She didn't blink. It's beautiful, right? She added. You should be proud. We've made it better. Better. She meant sterile, empty of soul, empty of me. I turned my head slowly, taking in the new lines of the building. Nothing creaked, nothing leaned. Everything was perfect in that unsettling way that hotel rooms are, and I hadn't even stepped inside yet. My hand tightened around the paper. My fingers ached. I didn't need to be a lawyer to know that if my name was still on the deed, they couldn't have done this without me. Or maybe they had. Maybe that was the point. Do it fast. Do it big. Do it so completely that I'd feel too overwhelmed to fight. Come on in, she said. I made chamomile tea. You should rest. You must be exhausted. I didn't move. My body felt cemented to the ground, like the roots of the tree she tore out without asking. Her smile didn't fade, but her eyes narrowed just a bit. I mean it, Larcenia. Let's not make this difficult. No. She'd made it difficult. I blinked once, twice, then turned my gaze back to the paper. The number swam again in my vision, $95,000, as if healing from a stroke wasn't enough. I was now being billed for the demolition of my life. I took a slow breath. My voice, when it came, was low and flat. I haven't even crossed the threshold yet. And yet, somehow, I already felt evicted. I don't remember stepping inside. One second I was standing in the doorway, holding that paper like it might vanish if I stared at it long enough. The next, I was across the threshold, blinking at a hallway that smelled like new paint and laminate floors. There was no creak beneath my boots, no faded runner rug, no coat rack we'd bought at that Sunday flea market downtown. Just a sterile stretch of gray walls and silence. It wasn't my house anymore. That became clear within seconds. Every room I passed confirmed it. The living room had been gutted. Gone were the warm wood bookshelves, the mismatched couch cushions, the old throw blanket that still smelled like us. In their place, leather recliners, glass-topped furniture, and abstract art in frames so perfectly level they made the room feel like a showroom. Cold, glossy, like no one had ever laughed here. The kitchen was worse. Where my spice rack once stood, there was now a built-in wine cooler. The table had been replaced by a high-top island with bar stools, sleek and too tall for my short legs, not a trace of my handwriting on the chalkboard wall where I used to jot down recipes or grocery lists, no coffee mug that said "Still Waking Up" in chipped black lettering. And then came the sound of footsteps from the back hallway, soft, dragging, Destry, my husband. He came into view wearing joggers and a faded t-shirt. His hair was messy, like he'd just woken up, and there was a sleep crease down one cheek. No sign of surprise on his face. Just a vague smile, like I was the one visiting him. Oh. Hey, babe, he said casually, as if we hadn't gone over 2 weeks without a single call from him. You're back early. I stared at him. Early? He gestured around him, oblivious. Mom told you about the remodel, right? Pretty great, huh? The open concept. Makes the space feel bigger. I didn't respond. My fingers curled slightly against my side. You okay? He asked, like someone who knew they were supposed to check in but didn't actually want an answer. I tried to keep my voice level. What happened here, Destry? He shrugged and leaned on the island. It was overdue. You've said it yourself. House needed work. Mom just got things moving while you were recovering. She hired some contractors, figured out the permits. Honestly, I didn't think we'd finish before you got back. You didn't think to wait? His expression twitched. We didn't know how long you'd be gone. And with your health, my health is not your shield. That caught him off guard. For a moment, he dropped the casual facade. She did this without asking me. You're on the deed, he said, avoiding my gaze. It's not like we did anything illegal. I blinked. Something about that phrasing. Wait, what did you just say? He ran a hand through his hair. You're still on the deed, technically. But Mom's co-owner now. It made sense. She paid the contractors, and since we planned to live together, my stomach turned. You changed the title? My voice dropped to a whisper, disbelief folding over the heat building in my chest. You signed the preliminary paperwork before the hospital, remember? I just followed through. Mom said it would help streamline everything. He said it like I'd authorized a pizza delivery. Streamline? I reached for the counter to steady myself. You used a signature I gave under entirely different circumstances. I agreed to look at refinancing options, not to hand over the house to your mother. It's not like we're kicking you out, he said, already defensive. You have your own unit now. We figured you'd want space to work. You decided that without me. He finally met my eyes, but there was no apology there. Just that tired, practiced tone he used when I caught him dodging questions. Look, you were gone, and things needed to move forward. Mom handled it. You mean she took over? She kept us afloat, Larcenia. You know I've been stretched thin. I didn't have time to, so you let her erase me. Don't be dramatic. There it was, that phrase, the same one he used when I cried in bed the first week after my diagnosis. The same tone he used when I said I needed more than silence from him. Don't be dramatic. I stepped back from the counter. My eyes scanned the room again, every inch of it, now alien. And suddenly, I needed to see what else they'd changed. I turned toward the hallway. Destry called after me, but I ignored him. I passed the half bathroom, renovated, new tile, a mirror I didn't recognize. At the end of the hall, where my art room used to be, the door was closed. The doorknob had been replaced with a sleeker, polished brass one. I opened it. The walls had been repainted beige, the window blinds were shut tight, the shelves were gone, my easel nowhere in sight. Instead, there was a desk, an executive-style one with a monitor, keyboard, even a printer, filing cabinets. A whiteboard hung on one wall with bullet points in red marker. HOA meeting. Thurs call Susan. Invoice schedule pest control. And right there, centered above the desk, was a small bronze plaque mounted on the door. Mayless Grayson, property manager. That was the moment I stopped feeling numb. They hadn't just repainted. They hadn't just restructured. They hadn't just borrowed space. They had overwritten my life, room by room, breath by breath. I stood there for a long time, hearing the faint buzz of the refrigerator down the hall and the occasional chirp of the motion light in the backyard. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stared. The woman who had once offered to help while I healed had claimed my home, my husband, and now, my sanctuary. I stepped back, letting the door click shut behind me. There was no welcome here. There was no us. There was only a woman who used my stroke to stage a takeover, and a man who called that progress. I didn't sleep that night. I lay still on the edge of a bed that used to be mine, staring up at a ceiling that no longer felt familiar. Even the light from the hallway, once soft and comforting, now cast sharp slats across the walls like a cage. Every sound in the house, closet doors creaking, faucets turning on, someone's voice murmuring through a phone, felt foreign, like I was hearing them in someone else's home. I'd never felt so misplaced under a roof with my name still on it. Around 8 in the morning, a knock came at the front door. I'd barely moved since dawn. I sat up slowly, gathering the frayed edges of my robe and walking down the hall in silence. Before I could reach the foyer, Mayless was already there, opening the door with that polished composure she wore like perfume. "Well, hello there," she chirped. A middle-aged woman stood on the porch holding a glass dish wrapped in foil. She had soft curls, rosy cheeks, and the air of someone who baked for comfort, not out of obligation. "I just wanted to drop this off," the woman said warmly. "Saw all the construction a few weeks ago and figured new tenants might appreciate something homemade." "Oh, how thoughtful," Mayless replied, taking the dish like it belonged to her. "We've had a bit of a transition, yes." The woman peered past her, catching sight of me in the hallway. Her eyes widened slightly with recognition, or maybe confusion. She gave a polite smile. "Oh, I didn't know Mayless had hired help." The sentence hung in the air like a wet sheet on a cold line. I didn't correct her. My mouth opened, then closed again. Malis didn't flinch, didn't laugh, didn't even glance my way. She just said, "Well, it's a big house. Lots to keep in order." I stood there, frozen in place, while the two of them exchanged pleasantries like I wasn't even present. When the neighbor left, Malis closed the door and turned to me. "She meant well," she said, brushing a speck of dust off the side table. "No need to make her feel awkward." I didn't answer. What was I supposed to say? That I didn't even recognize myself in this version of life they'd constructed? That maybe, in some awful way, that neighbor had only vocalized what the rest of the neighborhood now assumed? I walked back to my room, if you could call it that. The guest room. Not the room with my wedding dress still hanging behind the closet door. That room had been reconfigured. The door no longer creaked. Even the handle was new. As the day wore on, I wandered the house like a ghost chasing her past. The more I looked, the more I realized how much had been removed, not just mine, but specifically and surgically me. In the living room, a collage frame that once held photos from our honeymoon in British Columbia was now filled with Malis's pictures, her bridge club, her grandniece's baptism, her smiling at the ribbon cutting of the community garden, the family photo from our wedding reception, gone, the oil painting of my father I had framed after his passing, replaced by some generic watercolor of mountains. Every shelf, every wall, every corner had been scrubbed clean of my existence. Even the fireplace mantel, where I used to keep my mother's antique clock. It now hosted a scented candle and a decorative tray filled with seashells. Malis didn't even like the ocean. By early evening, I found myself in front of the door to my old art studio. I hadn't dared open it since returning. Something about that space had always been sacred, a place I protected, even from Destry, even from my own insecurities. It had been the only part of the house that felt entirely mine. The doorknob felt unfamiliar, cold. When I turned it, it didn't creak like it used to. The smell hit me first. Cleaning solution and air freshener, not the subtle traces of turpentine and charcoal. The walls, once dotted with sketches, vision boards, pinned up scraps of inspiration, were now bare and painted the same sterile beige that coated the rest of the house. No easel, no stool, no brushes, no stacked canvases leaning against the wall. In their place stood a tall shelving unit filled with office supplies, printer paper, and folders. A small desk sat in the corner with a laptop, a whiteboard above it covered in bullet-pointed reminders like call HOA rep and update Zillow listing. I didn't realize Malis had followed me until I heard her voice. "Oh, this room," she said casually. "I had to make it functional. You weren't really using it anymore." I turned to her slowly. "Where's my work?" She shrugged, picking a lint ball off her sleeve. "Some of it was in rough shape. I donated what I could. A couple of pieces got water damage during the drywall work. I figured you wouldn't miss them." "Donated?" I echoed. My voice was hollow. "You gave away my art?" She smiled. "Art is meant to be shared, Larcinia. It's not meant to sit in dusty corners waiting for someone to notice it." I stepped past her without another word, my hands shaking as I moved toward the old storage bin in the back of the room. It was the only thing that hadn't been replaced or rearranged. I knelt beside it and flipped the lid open. Inside, among a tangle of extension cords and mismatched charger cables, lay one of my watercolors, creased, stained, and bent. It was a piece I'd done after my mother passed. A blue window, cracked open, the sky melting into the room. It was never meant to be sold or shown, just kept. Someone had spilled something across the corner, the paper curled up at the edges. I pressed my fingers to the edge, too tired to cry, too stunned to scream. If they could do this to my art, what else had they buried? The door clicked behind me as Malis stepped out of the room. Alone again, I folded the painting carefully and cradled it in my arms. A ruined relic of a life they'd tried to erase. But I wasn't finished yet. It took me a full day to pull myself together after finding my painting torn and discarded like yesterday's mail. I didn't confront Malis. I didn't say a word to Destry. I needed space, not to escape, but to observe, to listen. If they could bury my art so neatly, I had no doubt they were burying other parts of me too. And I needed to find out what, before I ended up buried right alongside it. Late the next morning, I slipped out of the house with my tote bag slung over my shoulder. I didn't take my phone off airplane mode. I didn't leave a note. I walked 3 blocks down to a little cafe I hadn't been to in months, a quiet place tucked behind a florist and a dental office, the kind of spot where artists left their business cards beside their lattes. It used to be one of my favorites. They had the best lemon poppy seed scones and a bulletin board filled with local artwork. The bell over the door chimed softly as I entered. The girl behind the counter, someone I didn't recognize, gave me a half smile before turning back to her task of organizing spoons. I headed straight to the wall by the window, the same space where I'd once proudly pinned up 3 of my watercolors back when I was first trying to build a client base. They were long gone, of course. In their place, I spotted a piece I instantly recognized. A watercolor landscape, soft greens and browns, a distant farmhouse under a moody Oregon sky. My work, but not my name. Below the painting was a simple white placard that read, "Evening Haze," from the early portfolio of Destry Grayson. My lungs froze mid-inhale. I leaned closer, inspecting every brushstroke. The sky, the shading near the trees, the detail in the windows. I knew this piece like the back of my hand. I painted it on a rainy afternoon in 2017 while listening to a documentary about Dust Bowl farmers. I had accidentally spilled coffee on the corner and dabbed it dry with a paper towel, leaving a subtle stain that looked like sepia-toned fog. And yet, here it was, attributed to my husband. Displayed like some proud piece of his legacy. The cafe owner, a woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled into a clip, noticed me standing there. "Oh, you like that one?" she said, coming around the counter. "It's part of our local collection. Isn't it beautiful?" I nodded slowly, unsure how to form the words. She smiled, clearly enthusiastic. "His mother brought it in, said he never really promoted himself, but she's been encouraging him to revisit his creative side. Apparently, he used to paint back in college. Such talent, right?" I managed a polite hum. The woman went on, unaware. "She said he was always modest about it. That's how you know it's real, when they're not chasing attention." That last bit nearly knocked me off balance. I stared at the little tag again. "Evening Haze," from Destry's early portfolio, not ours, not inspired by. No shared credit, no mention of me. Just his. I muttered something about needing to make a call and stepped out into the street. The air outside was colder than I expected, and I didn't realize I'd been holding my breath until I finally exhaled, shaking. That painting was supposed to be part of a series I never finished. He never once held a brush when I worked on it. The only thing he'd done was tease me about how long I spent blending the clouds, and now it was his. I didn't walk home right away. I needed time to feel the ache fully, to let it settle instead of swallowing it again. After about 30 minutes, I made my way back, cutting through the side alley to avoid the main street. As I approached their house, I slowed. The living room window was open slightly, letting voices drift outside. I paused by the hedges. I wasn't proud of it, but I needed to hear something honest. Melis's voice carried clearly through the opening. "I'm telling you, she hasn't been stable since the hospital. The stroke rattled her more than she lets on." A long pause. "Of course, I'm doing my best. Destry can't do this alone. She doesn't even see how much we've kept this house together. If it weren't for me, God knows what kind of mess she'd come back to." Another pause, then a soft laugh. "She abandoned him, Karen. Walked right out of the marriage and expects to waltz back in like nothing happened? I had no choice but to take over." "She left us no option." I backed away from the hedge, bile rising in my throat. That wasn't just a lie. That was a full-on rewriting of history. I'd been in the hospital learning how to move my fingers again, how to walk without seeing 2 floors at once. I had sent postcards. I had left voicemails. I had asked Destry to visit. He didn't. And now, Melis was painting me as the villain in her carefully curated family portrait. Back inside the guest room, I sat on the edge of the bed, still clutching my coat, my fingers cold and numb. I pulled out my phone, finally flipping off airplane mode. 3 new messages blinked on the screen. One from a college friend. "Hey, I heard you moved out. Is everything okay?" One from Destry's cousin. Just checking in. Malis said you were dealing with some issues. Sorry if I'm overstepping. And one from a woman I hadn't seen in a decade. I'm sorry to hear about your separation. If you need to talk, I'm here. They were already rewriting me. Every day I stayed silent. The story was being reshaped, sentence by sentence. My absence was being weaponized. My recovery turned into abandonment. My art turned into someone else's talent. I opened a notes app on my phone and typed 5 words. They're rewriting me. I need to start writing back. By the time the sun began to dip behind the pine trees that evening, I had reread that note to myself at least 20 times. It sat on my phone screen like a warning flare. Short, pulsing, undeniable. They're rewriting me. I need to start writing back. Not with words, not yet. First, I needed receipts. After dinner, if you could call it that, I excused myself early, citing fatigue. The kitchen conversation was its usual theater, Malis musing about HOA regulations like she ran a township, and Destry humming in agreement between bites. No one noticed I barely touched my plate. Back in the guest room, I sat at the desk and pulled out my old notepad from the drawer. Years ago, when we first moved into the house, I had set up a doorbell camera. It was a small thing, an off-brand model from a Cyber Monday sale. Destry had laughed at me back then, teased that we weren't living in a crime movie. Still, I installed it myself, wired it right into the doorframe, and connected it to a Gmail account I hadn't opened since. I didn't have my laptop, conveniently lost during the remodel, according to Malis, but I still had access to the public library's computers. The next morning, I slipped out early, just after Malis left for her daily yoga class, and before Destry was fully awake. The cold air helped me think. At the library, I chose a corner terminal near the window, logged in, and began searching. It took a few tries, password resets, 2-step verifications sent to an email I hadn't touched in years, but eventually, I found the account. And inside that neglected inbox was a digital folder labeled Doorcam Footage, Grey House. The thumbnails loaded slowly on the screen. I clicked on the week I had gone into the hospital, just after my stroke, and leaned in. At first, there was nothing out of the ordinary, delivery trucks, mail carriers, squirrels. But then came the footage from the 3rd day after my hospitalization. Malis, standing in front of the door, talking animatedly to 2 men in neon vests. She unlocked the front door herself. No hesitation, no question. The video had audio too, faint but enough to catch snippets. The contractor paperwork is under my name now. Yes, the daughter's out of state, long-term recovery. Another clip. Same day, Malis standing on the porch, flipping through a folder of blueprints. And then another. A week later, she signs a delivery receipt, turns to someone off camera, and says, clear as a bell. By the time she gets back, it'll be too late to undo anything. I hit pause and just stared. Too late. Not if I had anything to say about it. I forwarded the footage to my personal email, twice, just in case. Then I printed screenshots with date and timestamps, labeling each one carefully. I saved copies to a USB drive I'd bought from the front desk for $2. It wasn't just about proving Malis had overstepped. This was proof that she'd planned the takeover, exploited my illness, and rewritten the truth while smiling through it. But I wasn't done yet. That afternoon, I reached out to a lawyer named Thomas Nolan, someone who'd helped me settle my father's estate 5 years ago. He wasn't flashy, but he was sharp and quiet. The kind of man who spoke like every word cost him a nickel and made sure each one counted. We met at a coffee shop 2 towns over. I brought the USB drive and printed materials in a plain folder, wrapped with a rubber band. He scanned through the papers without rushing. Then he looked at me over the rim of his glasses. Your name was removed from the deed, he said simply. I nodded. That's what I figured. He tapped the screen, rewatching Malis sign something on camera. I've seen this before. They move fast, exploit medical emergencies, change power of attorney when the person's incapacitated or confused. It's shady, but not always illegal, unless you can show forged documentation or manipulation. I can. He raised an eyebrow. Do you have the original title? I smiled. I made copies the day we bought the house. Malis didn't know where I stored them. and she never thought I'd remember the door cam. He leaned back, thoughtful. This is strong, Larcenia, very strong. But you need to be careful. People who build houses out of lies don't like it when the blueprints get aired out. I don't need to destroy them, I said. I just want my life back. He slid the folder toward me. Then let's build your case. When I returned home, it was already dusk. The porch light was on, and I could see Melis's silhouette in the kitchen, organizing something in her endless collection of labeled bins. Dinner was awkward, like always. The kitchen table had been repositioned to face the living room now, for better flow, she'd said last week. Everything felt performative. As I sat down, Destry passed me the roasted vegetables without a word. I set down my napkin deliberately. I spent some time at the library today, I said, buttering a roll. Melis paused mid-sentence. Oh? She asked, voice saccharine. Doing what, dear? Reviewing footage, I replied evenly. From the front door camera. Old stuff. You'd be surprised what a tiny lens remembers. Destry looked up, confused. Melis's fork clinked against her plate. There's really no need to dredge up. I looked at her directly. That's exactly why there is. The silence that followed was delicious. Later that night, I closed the door to the guest room and locked it for the first time. I spread out the documents on the desk. Every screenshot, every email, every contract with a questionable signature. Then I opened my suitcase and retrieved the worn, stained painting of the blue window, the one Melis had discarded. I taped it to the wall above my makeshift workspace, not as decoration. As a reminder, this wasn't about vengeance anymore. It was about preservation, about reclaiming what had been taken piece by piece under the guise of family and help and concern. I scanned letters, took photos of everything Melis had left lying around, notes scribbled in the margins of planner pages, property documents with her handwriting on mine. They hadn't expected me to fight. They thought I'd come back grateful. They dismissed me too early. They won't dismiss what comes next. When the morning light cut through the blinds of the guest room, I was already awake, sitting upright with my back pressed against the headboard. My eyes hadn't fully closed all night, not out of fear, but from the steady pulse of clarity humming beneath my skin. I'd spent the last several hours categorizing, scanning, uploading, building. I knew what I had, but I hadn't expected how quickly they'd respond. As I stepped out into the hallway, the house was eerily quiet. No hum of the coffee maker, no clinking dishes, just a folded piece of paper sitting on the entryway bench, propped neatly against a suitcase. My suitcase. I approached slowly, my pulse surprisingly calm, as if my body had already anticipated the message. A pale yellow post-it was attached to the handle of my bag. It's time we make space for the upstairs tenant. You'll understand. No name, no signature. Just Melis's handwriting, precise, tight, unapologetic. So this was it. No confrontation, no yelling match, just a quiet exile. A removal masked as reasonable adjustment. It didn't matter that the upstairs unit technically didn't exist yet, or that no such tenant had been mentioned before. The point was clear. I was no longer welcome, not even tolerated. For a brief moment, I stood there and looked around. The house didn't look any different, but it felt emptier than I could have imagined, not just in memory, but in meaning. I picked up the suitcase, turned around, and walked back down the hallway I once called my home. By mid-morning, I was sitting on a bus headed across town, my suitcase at my feet, my phone silent in my lap. I didn't cry. I didn't reach for Destry. I didn't even check my email. Instead, I looked out the window and let the roads roll past like credits on a movie I hadn't agreed to star in. I sent one text while transferring at the Eugene Central Station. Hey, Ruth. You once told me to come by if I ever needed a bed. Is that offer still good? Her reply came almost instantly. Front porch keys in the same place. You're always welcome, honey. I didn't realize how much I needed that kindness until I stepped off the bus 2 stops later and saw her porch light still hanging askew from the last windstorm. Something about its imperfection felt honest. Ruth didn't ask questions when I arrived. She handed me a cup of tea, pointed to the spare bedroom and said, "We'll talk when you're ready," or not at all. It was the first true silence I'd felt in weeks. That evening, after dinner, I unpacked slowly. The suitcase held more resentment than belongings, and yet tucked in the front pocket was something I'd forgotten I saved, a flash drive. Back when we bought the house, I had scanned copies of every legal document, title deed, property tax receipts, the first joint mortgage application. I didn't trust cloud storage then. I wanted something tangible, physical, mine. I plugged the flash drive into Ruth's desktop computer, and there it was. The original deed, dated and notarized, with only my name on it. No co-owner, no addendum, no malus, just me. I sat there, staring at that document for a long time, letting the truth anchor me. Later that night, I was flipping through my email archives, searching for anything related to property transfers or banking, and something caught my eye. It was an email from Destry's work address, forwarded to our joint email. It was short, titled, Loan Docs, Final. Attached was a PDF. I opened it, heart already bracing for impact. At the top was a logo I recognized, our credit union. Below it, a $95,000 renovation loan approval form, filed 2 months prior. And at the bottom, my signature. Only, I hadn't signed it. Not then, not in the hospital, not from a recovery bed with IVs strapped to my arms and double vision clouding my name. The signature looked almost identical, but it was missing the tell I always included, an extra curl in the G of Grayson. And the date? It aligned with the week I was sedated after surgery. I printed everything, first the PDF, then my original deed, then the email header. I arranged them side by side like puzzle pieces snapping into place. Fraud. This wasn't just betrayal. This was identity theft. And it was time I stopped pretending they didn't know what they were doing. The next morning, I returned to Thomas Nolan's office, manila folder in hand. He didn't offer coffee this time. He saw my face and opened the conference room door immediately. I spread the documents on the table. He didn't speak while reading. Then, finally, "This isn't just unethical. This is prosecutable." I nodded. "I want to pursue it." He leaned back. "It won't be quick, and it won't be quiet." "I don't need quiet," I said. "I need the truth on paper again." We discussed next steps, affidavits, preservation notices, initiating the discovery process. He would start with a formal letter to both Malus and Destry, the kind that came with a tracking number and a legal seal. That night, I returned to Ruth's place and went straight to the back bedroom. I didn't eat, didn't turn on the TV. I laid the documents out again and opened a blank journal. Across the top of the first page, I wrote, "Timeline of Truth." Then I began writing, the dates, the decisions, the lies, every meeting, every voicemail, every shift in behavior. I documented the cold dinner table, the silence when I walked in, the moment Destry handed Malus my favorite mug without a blink. They had tried to evict me from my home, my marriage, my identity. But now, I was building something else. I whispered aloud, though no one was around to hear it. I may be out of the house, but now, they're in my court. Ruth didn't ask where I'd been all day. When I got back to her house just after 6, she had already set the table for 2, like she somehow knew I'd be too tired to pretend I wasn't hungry. Over a quiet dinner of baked chicken and green beans, we barely spoke. But it was the good kind of quiet, the kind where silence wasn't absence, but presence. When I finished washing the dishes, I glanced down at my phone. One unread message from Thomas. "If you're serious about proceeding, we need to keep a public record. Don't disappear. Be seen." I stared at that line longer than I should have. Be seen. After a long breath and a short debate with myself, I grabbed my coat from the back of Ruth's chair. "I need to go back for dinner," I said. She looked up. "Are you sure?" "No. But I'm done letting them pretend I don't exist." It was a 10-minute walk to the house. By the time I reached the porch, dusk had settled into the trees behind the neighborhood. The air was cold, and so was the welcome. Destry opened the door with a blank expression, neither surprised nor pleased to see me. "You're joining us?" he asked, stepping aside. "I'm still legally part of this family, aren't I?" He didn't answer. Malis was already at the table, dressed in one of her pastel sweater sets, sipping wine and arranging the silverware like she was hosting a talk show segment. I sat down across from her without a word. Dinner was baked salmon and something green that had been over-steamed. The conversation stayed on HOA topics, neighborhood rumors, and some distant cousin's engagement. No one asked where I'd been. No one offered me a glass. Then, halfway through a story about the community garden's broken fence, Malis glanced up from her plate. "You know," she said, her tone feather-light, "it's hard to imagine how quickly people fold under pressure these days." I kept my fork still. "Take Janice from the library board," she continued, eyes on Destry now. "Had a minor health scare and just unraveled. Her poor husband had to take over everything. It's amazing what people expect others to clean up." The wine in her glass caught the overhead light just enough to flash red. Destry didn't look at me. He just nodded slightly, chewing his food like it was a task on a to-do list. I didn't respond. After dinner, I helped stack plates in the sink, out of habit. Malis didn't thank me. Destry disappeared into the garage. I walked out the front door alone, wanting the air more than I wanted closure. That's when I heard the voice, soft, hesitant. "Larcenia?" I turned to see Margaret, the neighbor from 3 doors down, walking her dog. "Oh," she said gently, adjusting her scarf. I wasn't sure it was you. Malis told us that you'd checked into a facility, for recovery, you know." She said it with a half wince, like someone unsure if the punchline had gone too far. I stood still. "A facility?" "She said you left the house to work on yourself. That you weren't living here anymore." Margaret pulled her coat tighter. "Honestly, we all assumed something had happened. No one saw you for weeks." Something had happened, but it wasn't what Malis was feeding the neighborhood. I nodded once, short and flat, and Margaret gave me a pitying smile before continuing down the sidewalk. It hit me then, not just the betrayal, but the precision of it. Malis wasn't just rewriting my marriage. She was erasing my public identity, brick by brick, in every casual chat and friendly wave. I didn't go back to Ruth's immediately. Instead, I walked a few more blocks, turned a corner, and stood in front of a familiar porch. The lights were still on. I knocked twice, waited. The door opened to the warm, lemon-scented air of my old art teacher's home. "Miss Ruth," I said softly. She stepped aside without asking anything. I followed her into the small living room where canvases lined the walls and the floor creaked just the way I remembered. "I need to ask you something," I said, hands shaking slightly. "When I was in the hospital, did you see anything?" She didn't blink. "Yes," she said. "I saw Malis throwing boxes into the back of her car. Your things, art supplies, framed photos." She dropped a stack near the trash bin like they didn't mean a thing. I swallowed hard. "Did she say anything?" "She saw me watching," Ruth replied calmly. "Told me you'd signed the house over. Said you didn't want any of it anymore. That you were leaving Oregon." "And you believed her?" Ruth shook her head. "No, that's why your extra key's still under my porch mat." I smiled, but it didn't reach all the way up. She patted the armrest next to her. "I've known liars, sweetheart, and I've known survivors. I see which one you are." I stayed for tea, letting the warmth settle into my fingers as Ruth talked about her new students and local gossip. She didn't press for details. She just let me sit in my truth for a while. Back at her house later that night, I laid out my documents again, scanned files, screenshots, email chains. Every page told the real story Malis had tried to bury. I slid them into a leather case, zipped it tight, and walked to the mirror. I looked older, stronger, clearer. "Time to return everything to where it belongs," I whispered. The morning of the meeting, I woke before the alarm. The house was silent, Ruth still asleep in the back room, and the sky outside the window was painted with soft pinks and lavender. I sat at the edge of the bed and stared at the manila folder on the nightstand. Inside it, every receipt, document, screenshot, and timeline that I had quietly assembled over the last 3 weeks. I had dressed deliberately, not to intimidate, but to remind them who they thought they'd erased. Navy blazer, slacks, low-heeled shoes, the same pair I wore to my mother's memorial, and later to sign the deed to the home Malis tried to steal from me. Thomas met me at the notary office 15 minutes before the scheduled time. He wore his usual charcoal gray suit, his briefcase neatly tucked under one arm. He gave me a small nod, no smile. "You ready?" he asked. "I've been ready." We sat in the conference room, a sterile space with frosted windows and a humming fluorescent light overhead. On the table, 2 pens, a stack of legal documents, and my folder. Destry and Malus arrived precisely on time, which surprised me. Destry looked like he'd barely slept. His shirt was wrinkled, and he kept adjusting the cuffs like he couldn't quite get comfortable. Malus, on the other hand, walked in with the kind of poise only someone who'd spent their life pretending could master. Pastel suit jacket, matching scarf, hair sprayed into perfect place. She nodded toward me, as if we were running into each other at a grocery store. "Larcenia," I didn't reply. We all sat. The notary introduced herself, verified our IDs, and explained the process. I waited until the formalities passed before sliding the folder across the table. "This," I said, voice steady, "is everything." Thomas opened it methodically and laid each piece before them, like cards in a game they were no longer winning. First, the original deed with only my name. Malus frowned slightly. Then the screenshots from the doorbell footage, showing her letting in contractors, signing off deliveries, and telling someone, "She's out of state long term, this won't be reversed." Her mouth pressed into a line. Next, the forged loan document. I watched Destry shift in his seat. He leaned forward to look at the signature. "You signed this," Thomas said, tapping the page, "using her name, while she was in the hospital." I thought she authorized it," Destry said, eyes darting. "Really?" I asked. "Because I don't recall giving you power of attorney from a hospital bed I couldn't even sit up in." Malus broke in, voice brittle. "There's no need to dramatize. Families make joint decisions all the time. We were maintaining the property." "By reassigning ownership?" Thomas said calmly. "Removing her name? Staging a remodel without consent? Claiming she'd abandoned the home?" "I never said that." "You did," I interrupted. "To Margaret, to the mailman, to the entire neighborhood. You told people I'd checked into a facility, that I'd left Destry, that I didn't want the house anymore." Malus flushed, the first real sign of color in her cheeks all day. "I did what was necessary," she said. "Someone had to take responsibility." "You took more than that." Destry looked down at his hands. I pulled out one final page, a signed statement from Ruth, detailing what she'd witnessed. The trashing of my belongings, the conversations she'd overheard, the moment Malus claimed I'd moved on. Thomas folded his hands. "You have 2 options. Sign the property back over. Vacate within 2 weeks. Cease any contact, or we move forward with civil litigation, fraud, identity misuse, property theft. The evidence will stand." The silence was thick. Destry finally spoke, voice low. "Do we really need to go to court?" Thomas didn't answer. I did. "I didn't bring you here to threaten you. I brought you here to give you the chance to walk away without dragging this further." Malus opened her mouth, but no sound came. I stared straight into her eyes. "You tried to write me out of my own life. I'm putting myself back in." The notary laid out the papers. Malus hesitated for one breath, then signed. Her hand trembled ever so slightly. Destry followed suit without looking up. When it was done, I picked up my copy of the new title. My name, alone, restored. As they stood to leave, Malus turned back, voice softer now. "You know this isn't what I wanted." "No," I said. "You wanted me quiet." She blinked, but didn't argue. They left without a backward glance. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. Later that evening, back at Ruth's, I poured myself a glass of water and sat down with my journal. I opened to a fresh page and wrote with slow, careful strokes. "There are louder ways to scream. This one was mine." 2 months passed. The silence after the storm settled into a rhythm I hadn't known I needed. The house, my house, breathed differently now. No more passive-aggressive clinking of dishes, no surveillance disguised as concern, no footsteps hovering just outside the door. Every room was quiet in the way only true peace can be. I repainted the studio first. I chose a color that felt like Exhale, muted sage with just enough warmth to invite, not intimidate. The floors still bore scratches from the furniture Melis had dragged in, but I didn't cover them. I left them visible, honest. A map of what had been broken and what had survived. The windows, once shuttered with blinds she'd installed, were now open to the light. The sun filtered through in patches across the walls. I hung up my old pieces, not the ruined ones, but those I had stored safely, away from her reach. Some were finished, others incomplete. All were mine. I opened the space as a studio for kids in the neighborhood, especially those from homes like the one I'd come from, or the one I'd married into. Kids who needed room to explore without someone rearranging their boundaries. Every Saturday morning, the laughter started early. Paper rustling, paintbrushes clinking in jars. "Miss Larcenia, can I use gold? What happens if I mix purple with green? Can I draw a house with a tree inside?" Yes to all of it. It wasn't therapy. It wasn't about fixing anyone. It was about showing them there was still a place to create something no one could take. That particular Tuesday afternoon was quieter. The older kids had gone home. A girl named Naomi stayed behind, focused on a charcoal sketch she was still refining. I sat at the back desk, reviewing supply orders, when the knock came. 3 steady taps. It wasn't the hesitant shuffle of a parent dropping off a late student, or the excited pounding of a child eager to share a masterpiece. It was deliberate. I looked through the front window before I opened the door. Melis stood there, thinner than I remembered. Her blazer, once immaculate, now hung slightly loose at the shoulders. Destry stood beside her, looking smaller somehow, not physically, but like a balloon that had finally run out of air. She didn't say anything at first, just looked at me. I opened the door partway, didn't invite them in. Melis cleared her throat. We didn't want to come unannounced, but I was wondering if we could speak, just for a moment." Destry added, "Not to argue, just to talk." I nodded once, but didn't move from the threshold. "About what?" She hesitated, as if the act of humility itself was choking her. I wanted to say I didn't realize how far I'd gone. And I know saying sorry doesn't mean much, but I needed to try." I let that hang in the air. Destry shifted his weight. "We've been staying in a short-term rental. Things are not great. But that's not why we're here. It's not about the house," Melis said quickly. "It's about us. Us. As if that word hadn't been weaponized to shut me out in the first place." Behind me, Naomi laughed softly at something on the radio. The moment broke something inside me, not in pain, but in decision. "I appreciate you coming," I said carefully, "and I hear you, but this space isn't open for that conversation." Melis blinked. "What do you mean?" I opened the door just wide enough to let them see the small, hand-painted sign I'd taped inside the glass earlier that morning. It read, "This space is for those who lost their voice, not for those who took others away." Neither of them spoke. I nodded once, gently closed the door, and turned the lock. I stood there for a long breath before walking back into the studio. Naomi looked up. "Was that someone mad at you?" "No," I said with a smile. "Just someone who finally had to listen to silence." She nodded as if she understood, even though she didn't have to. Later that night, after the kids were gone and the brushes were rinsed, I stayed in the studio alone. The radio played softly in the corner, a local station, familiar host, familiar tone. "Sometimes," he said, "justice isn't loud. It's simply someone not breaking." I looked around the studio, the soft light, the dry canvases, the wall where I'd written a quote from my mother in faint pencil. "You don't have to win loud, you just have to still be standing." I closed my eyes. I wasn't whole yet, but I was finally mine again. In life, the people closest to us can sometimes be the ones who cut the deepest, but it's what we do with that pain that defines us. Larcenia's story reminds us that silence isn't weakness, and walking away can sometimes be the strongest move of all. Have you ever felt erased in your own home? Let us know in the comments. We want to hear your story. If this family story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you won't miss the next one. There's more truth, more healing, and more voices that need to be heard.